For more than 6 years, one question has refused to disappear from American history. That morning, a special motorcade was moving slowly through downtown Dallas as crowds gathered along the streets. Thousands of people gathered along the streets as the procession moved through downtown Dallas. The motorcade then entered Dealey Plaza, passing through the heart of downtown Dallas. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, gunfire suddenly changed everything.
Within moments, the motorcade left Dealey Plaza and headed toward a nearby hospital.
At the hospital, doctors immediately began emergency treatment. By the end of that day, America had entered a moment that would change its history forever.
Within hours, investigators began working to understand exactly what had happened.
Officers began collecting statements, examining evidence, and reconstructing the events of the afternoon. Every detail mattered, from the location of the motorcade to the movements of people inside the area. Investigators also returned to the area where the shots had been reported, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. The search for physical evidence quickly became one of the most important parts of the investigation. As the hours passed, separate pieces of evidence began to form a much larger picture. But the investigation was only beginning, and many of the most important questions had not yet been answered.
By nightfall, the city was searching for answers, while investigators were preparing for a case that would soon become one of the most closely examined investigations in American history.
As the investigation continued, attention began to focus on one man who was no longer where investigators expected him to be.
Investigators were now tracing the movements of the missing suspect through the streets of Oak Cliff.
A local witness noticed a suspicious man moving quickly through the neighborhood and followed him toward a nearby theater.
The trail led to the Texas Theater, where police were soon called. Inside, officers moved quietly through the dark theater, looking for the man they believed they were searching for. Within moments, a struggle broke out as officers moved in to make the arrest.
The suspect was taken into custody and removed from the theater as reporters and witnesses gathered outside.
By early afternoon, investigators had a suspect in custody. But the questions surrounding the case were only beginning.
After the arrest, investigators brought the suspect back to police headquarters for questioning.
Investigators began asking questions about his movements, his background, and the events of that day. At the same time, investigators were comparing statements and evidence from different parts of the case.
Piece by piece, investigators tried to reconstruct a timeline of what had happened. But the evidence did not immediately answer every question.
Different witnesses remembered different details, and investigators still had to determine which pieces of information could be trusted. As the night continued, investigators were still searching for a complete explanation. The arrest had produced a suspect, but it had not produced all the answers. Investigators soon realized that understanding the case meant looking far beyond the events of one afternoon. Years before Dallas, the young man at the center of the investigation had served in the United States Marine Corps.
After leaving military service, he traveled overseas and eventually made his way to the Soviet Union.
He spent years in the Soviet Union, before eventually returning to the United States.
Back in America, his life took him to New Orleans, where his political activities began attracting attention.
He became involved with political causes, and publicly expressed strong views about Cuba and international affairs.
In the fall of 1963, he traveled south to Mexico City, a journey that would later become an important part of the investigation.
His brief trip to Mexico City would later raise some of the most persistent questions surrounding his past.
Back in Dallas, investigators were examining the building connected to the shooting. On an upper floor, investigators began searching the area for physical evidence. Near a window, investigators discovered 3 spent cartridge cases on the floor. Police photographed the evidence in place before disturbing anything.
Minutes later, another discovery drew even more attention. A rifle hidden among the boxes.
The weapon was photographed where it had been found, before investigators carefully removed it for examination. At the laboratory, technicians began examining the weapon and the ammunition for connections to the shooting.
For investigators, the physical evidence was beginning to tell a story of its own.
Investigators now had to determine whether the physical evidence could be connected to the suspect.
The weapon was examined alongside other evidence collected during the investigation. Investigators also examined a paper bag found near the location from which the shots were believed to have come.
Fingerprints, fibers, and other small traces were examined for possible connections. Investigators were building a timeline that connected the evidence with movements inside the building.
Back at the building, investigators continued comparing the physical scene with the developing timeline. With each comparison, investigators believed the physical evidence was pointing toward a single sequence of events.
But connecting the evidence was only part of the story. The next question was whether the entire case could be explained by one gunman acting alone.
Even with the evidence assembled, some questions remained difficult to answer. Investigators had to determine whether every piece of evidence fit the same sequence of events.
Years later, people would continue returning to the same locations, trying to understand what the evidence really meant. New researchers would later examine the same evidence and ask whether every conclusion had been fully established.
The case quickly became a national story, and every new detail was examined by newspapers and the public. As the story spread across the country, public opinion began forming around evidence that was still being examined.
And that is where the mystery became larger than the original investigation. What was proven, what was assumed, and what remained uncertain.
More than 6 decades later, the evidence remains available. But the questions surrounding that day continue to shape one of America's most debated historical mysteries.
After the assassination, a major federal investigation was created to examine the evidence and establish what had happened. Investigators reviewed testimony, photographs, physical evidence, and reports collected from Dallas.
Dozens of witnesses were questioned as investigators attempted to establish a complete timeline.
The investigation compared different accounts against the physical evidence collected at the scene. After months of investigation, the findings were compiled into a massive official report. The official conclusion presented one explanation for the assassination and the evidence surrounding it. But the publication of the report did not end the debate.
Even after the official investigation was completed, researchers and the public continued examining the evidence for themselves.
As the official findings became public, the assassination remained at the center of national attention.
For millions of Americans, television and newspapers became the main way to follow the investigation. Over time, The case moved from breaking news into the pages of American history. Decades later, researchers continued returning to the original records and evidence.
New generations examined the same evidence with new questions and different interpretations. Today, visitors still come to Dallas to see the places where the events unfolded.
The locations remain almost ordinary to look at, yet they are permanently connected to one of the most studied events in American history.
And more than 6 decades later, the story remains a reminder of how a single day can leave questions that outlive generations.
After decades of investigation, the evidence still tells a complicated story.
The original investigation reached one conclusion, based on the evidence available at the time. Years later, another major investigation questioned whether the earlier inquiry had fully addressed the possibility of a conspiracy. Different investigators reached different conclusions about what the evidence could prove.
Today, the locations remain real, the records remain available, and the debate continues.
But history is not only about the questions we ask. It is also about separating what is documented from what remains uncertain.
More than 6 decades later, one thing remains certain. November 22, 1963 changed American history forever.
And perhaps that is why the story still matters. The evidence can be studied, the history can be debated, but the questions left behind continue to echo.